This is episode 7 with authors Flynn Coleman and Drew Dudley. Welcome to the Futures Intelligent Leadership Flowcast. This is your host, Tyler Mongan. I am the president of Haku Global. This is a space for globally minded experts to dialogue about the future of leadership with a focus on the key question, how can leadership be more intelligent about futures? From this conversation, innovative wisdom, practical tools, and actionable insights emerge to help future-ready leaders thrive in an uncertain, complex, and exponentially changing world. Let's jump in to the dialogue. Aloha and welcome to this episode of the Futures Intelligent Leadership Flowcast. I'm excited because this is episode number 7, and they say that most podcasts don't last past 7 episodes. So this is a really big milestone, and I've already got several guests lined up to record at least another 7 episodes, and my plan is to continue this for the next 3 years, which I think are really important transition years for leadership between 2020 and 2023. I've just arrived back in Honolulu, Hawaii. This episode was actually recorded in the airport in Tokyo at Haneda Airport. In this episode, I'm joined by Flynn Coleman in New York and Drew Dudley in Canada. Interestingly, they are both recent authors, and their book topics, as you'll see in this dialogue, are fresh on their minds. Flynn is an international lawyer, professor, and the author of a new book, A Human Algorithm: How Artificial Intelligence is Redefining Who We Are. It's a groundbreaking narrative on the urgency of ethically designed AI and a guidebook to reimagine life in the era of intelligent technology. Flynn has written extensively on the issues of global citizenship, the future of work and purpose, emerging technologies, political reconciliation, war crimes, genocide, human and civil rights, humanitarian issues, innovation and design for social impact, and improving access to justice and education. Now, Drew is the author of This is Day One, a practical guide to leadership that matters. He is the founder and chief catalyst of Day One Leadership, helping individuals and organizations create cultures of leadership through the identification and operationalization of key leadership values. Drew's work, as you'll learn in this episode, is focused on helping people identify and adopt a personal leadership philosophy rooted in value-driven decision-making. Individuals who are seen as having a personal leadership philosophy are rated as 110% more effective as leaders and are 130% more likely to be trusted. Now, I'm really excited about this dialogue because Drew and Flynn are both very well spoken and really understand the nature and importance of their work. We discuss how to build momentum towards the future within a context of uncertainty and complexity by taking one day at a time, how to build values into the story of the future, why we should re-examine the identity of leadership outside the constraints of influence and power, why current leaders might need to give up their seats or pass the mic to those who have not had a place or a voice in the future, and also the challenges of having the courage to give up your seat. We talk about the differences between equity and equality and why leaders are not the center of the equation. Let's listen. So welcome, Drew and Flynn. Really excited to have you both here today. And I want to start, as always, with this key question of what does it mean for leaders or leadership to be intelligent or smart about futures given uncertainty, complexity, and the exponential change in the world? And love for both of you to start by answering that question from your unique perspective and work. And love to start with Flynn and hear what you think about that.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Tyler, for having me. I'm so excited to be on the line with you and Drew. And this is a beautiful question, and I'm not surprised considering how beautiful Tyler's work is. But this idea about intelligent leadership in an uncertain, increasingly complex future is something I think about a lot. I think that obviously, having written a book on the future of artificial intelligence, one of the main premises I think about a lot that's in my book is that the future is so uncertain And it is so increasingly complex that this idea of learning to thrive in uncertainty, I think, is actually one of the key skills of the future. And, just to kind of put the idea out there that we still don't even have a fully universal definition of what human intelligence is. So when we think about intelligence, I love the idea of expanding it beyond just what we traditionally think about intelligence to all the different beautiful prismatic diversity of intelligence we see in the world all around us, really expanding and broadening that definition. And I think those are some of the skills. Having that imagination collectively and individually is going to be crucial for an increasingly complex world.
Right. And Drew, how do you that question from the perspective of your work?
Well, what's interesting is that I wrote a book called This is Day One, and the whole concept of day one is the reason that I talk about day one so prominently is because it's the only real thing that I'm certain about. I think that Flynn said something when she said, the dealing with uncertainty. If I could go back to, I don't know, my first day of high school and give myself one talent, it would be the ability to be comfortable with uncertainty. Because I think that one of the things that stands in a lot of our ways of moving forward is that if we don't know what the future holds, I think we sometimes tread water in the present because we're afraid whatever decision we make now is going to screw up the future. And so in the context of my work, what I try to focus on is, look, how do we keep momentum moving for ourselves and for our teams and for our organizations when we have no idea what the future holds? And how do we keep ourselves from getting paralyzed into inaction right now simply because we can't see 3 steps ahead? And we spend so much time trying to figure out 3 steps ahead that we forget, look, sometimes we're going to have to move without truly knowing where we're going. And so for me, my work is focused on, all right, 5-year momentum is more important than 5-year plans because we don't know what's going to happen 5 years from now, but we can make decisions today that build momentum. So really for me, my work is focused on the idea that we don't know the future. We can't know the future, and we cannot stay inactive as we try to figure it out. What we have to do is keep up enough momentum so that we can continue to have control and steer as we move forward through uncertainty.
Yeah, I really like this idea of dealing with uncertainty. And one of the things that kind of comes up for me is, how, I guess, playing off of Drew's ideas, how do we build momentum into the right future? Because as soon as we start building this momentum as a leader, things naturally start to move in a direction. And I kind of relates a lot to, I think, Flynn's work in like artificial intelligence and how there's a certain momentum for that right now. So Drew, what do you think about that? Just kind of following up on yours.
Well, I guess one thing I'd love to know from Flynn is, are we actually, here, or are we just sort of one giant computer simulation? Because once I figure that out, I can stop worrying about it quite as much. But, a big part of the work that I try to focus on is, look, when you don't know the future, the best you can do is to try to identify who you want to be in that future. And so maybe that's the big, and I'd be interested in hearing this from Flynn, because my work focuses a lot on identifying your core values and using them as criteria for decision making, and not only living your values every time you get the chance, but actually creating a plan to do it. And so, what I'd be interested in is this idea of, is it possible in the world of artificial intelligence and computers, is this like, how do the idea of artificial intelligence and how does the concept of values fit into a world of artificial intelligence, and how does that relate to us? Like, does artificial intelligence, can it learn values? How does it identify? How does it define them? And how does it use them? Is this a concept that's uniquely human, or is this something that can be dealt with from a non-human mind?
Flynn, what do you think? Do you have any insight on that?
Of course, in writing my book, A Human Algorithm, these are things I think about a lot. That being said, as a human rights lawyer, I came at it from a very unique angle, having worked at the intersection of human rights and technology. I was also a war crimes and genocide lawyer. So I come at it from a very unique angle. And part of the reason my book, is radical, though I hope it won't always be the case, is that I make a case for not just building things, but building them with values and ethics and a moral compass very much at the core of the technology and the teams that we're building, creating that technology and the entire ecosystem. Because technology, artificial intelligence, but also all of our world's major issues are going to affect all of us. Yet traditionally, so few of us have a voice and a say. And so I think it's an interesting parallel with Drew's work, because the idea is that we all have a voice that matters. We all have a story to tell. That's kind of core to my work as a human rights lawyer. And so the entire book is kind of laying out arguments, frameworks, ideas in a rather unique way as to how we might build values into our future, because this is going to affect all of us. And the train has already left the station. The technology is advancing more rapidly than ever before. So we've always had technology, but now it's advancing so rapidly. And the question is not just, building smarter tools, but how can they make the world a better place? These are the questions of our time, but also, the oldest questions we've asked ourselves. What does it mean to be human? And I make a pretty provocative argument, though hopefully it won't always be so, that no, humans aren't the only ones at the center. And there's a vast panoply of intelligence that we can admire, respect, and learn from.
Well, it's interesting. One thing I've been asked a lot during Q&As after my sessions is I talk about a value is only a value if you use it as criteria for decision making. So otherwise, it's just stuff that looks good on a website. And it's interesting, given the work that you've done, Flynn, and as a human rights lawyer, as somebody who's has deep understanding of the concepts of genocide, I always get asked this. You say that you should make decisions based on your values, but what if your values are negative? And so I just wonder, if somebody is making their decision honestly based on values, but are values only positive? Because this is something I deal with too, and I'm guessing you had to think of it as well. What if somebody genuinely is saying, hey, I'm living my values, but we see those values as causing tremendous pain and harm to other people? Is it still a value? That's something that I get asked a lot. And it sounds like maybe you're coming from a perspective where that's probably popped up in your work as well. When people are driven by their quote unquote values, are they really values if those decisions are being driven by ideologies that hurt people?
Yes, I think about that a lot. Certainly, I teach a leadership class actually at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And a question that often comes up with certainly no easy answers is leadership just the ability to really mobilize people for your cause? Or should we be defining leadership as leadership done for the good? And I think it's very similar to what you're saying, because same with business. When I teach a leadership and business class, the students, and it really changes year to year, say, well, is business just there to make a profit? Or should the future of business actually also be to give back within its very mission? And so these are the things that come up. And while there are no easy answers, I think that one thing for sure is that we need to be having more conversations. David White would call them courageous conversations about these questions of values and leadership, with more diverse groups of people involved in the decision making too.
Yeah, you hit that so on the head for me, because one of the things that I think is really important is the first example you're ever given of a concept not only shapes how you think of that concept for the rest of your life, but it limits how you think about it. And I've been giving a lot of thought to that idea about who we call a leader. And we basically started to call anybody who has influence and power, we call them leaders. And I wonder what you think of this, Flynn. Do you think there's a benefit to potentially making a bigger conscious effort when people are young to not loop people into one big category of leader just based on the influence they have, but rather perhaps on what I've been trying to do is to try to distinguish between two types of people, leaders and catalysts for harm. Because when I learned the concept of catalysts, I think in grade 10 biology, I love this idea that it was something that didn't necessarily have power in and of itself, but when added to the right collection of things, unleashed power that wasn't there without it. And I started to realize that all leaders are catalysts, but not all catalysts are leaders. And the problem is that when we hold people up who exploit other human beings to make a profit or take rights away from people in order to get power and profile, and we call them leaders, what we're saying to young people is, hey, you got two options on how to be a leader. Do good in the world or step on people and get power in the world. But either way, you're still going to end up as a leader. Do you see that maybe there'd be a benefit to no longer allowing or being a little bit more conscious about how we teach leadership to young people, so that we don't treat people who get influence in either way, positive or negative, as if they're the same thing at the end, because I think right now we are.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack in there. And one example that kept coming to mind as you were speaking is one I can speak to and do speak about a lot, which is the idea of gender equality in leadership.
Mm.
So, of course, there's myriad examples and they're intersectional, and everyone has a different lived experience. So, I certainly couldn't speak for all women, and I certainly couldn't speak for everyone generally. But when you're talking, it reminds me of, not only is leadership seen as one specific thing we're taught when we're young, but usually it's a certain gender, a certain race, from a certain cultural background. And so we've started to see some real movement towards broadening that generally, because when we put people in a box, first of all, it's only natural. We're animals, and we're trained to categorize, to save our own lives, to be able to differentiate danger from non-danger, but that's very much hurting us now. So I think being put in a box and categorization is really dangerous. But your idea of trying to kind of, splice out this idea of leadership from maybe something else, I think is a really interesting idea, because we learn so much of this so young, and then we spend a lifetime trying to unpack it and unlearn it. And that is really helped when there's more representation and inclusion as to what a leader can be, and also shifting our viewpoint from being a leader isn't just one thing, and maybe being a leader means something more than just mobilizing and organizing people. So I think it's really difficult, tough work, but it's important to have these conversations for sure.
It's interesting because, I think you're hitting on a topic that's very timely, one thing, but also something I thought about too, in this idea that the past as a business or a leader in business, you could achieve a mission and vision, but not follow any of your values, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be seen as successful in some ways. However, recently the World Economic Forum, I don't know if you're familiar, they have a Davos Manifesto, and they asked the question of, like, what's the universal purpose of a business in the fourth industrial revolution? And they actually came up with this idea that companies not only need to serve shareholders as a key focus anymore, but also all stakeholders, right? Employees, customers, communities, and even society at large. So it's kind of interesting how there is this shift now, even in the business world, of the purpose of business, and that's going to shift the purpose of leadership and how they get there. So I think there's a lot in this idea of values and its relationship to mission and vision, and there's a lot of work to be done, like you said. So Drew, how can leaders do the work?
Yeah, what's interesting is you say, Davos sends that out, and the question is, when they put that out in the manifesto, are they saying, yeah, we really believe this, or do they want everyone to see them put that out in a manifesto? Because really, are the people who are at Davos, it's really hard to rise to the top of a system and then look back at the system that put you at the top and say, wow, this needs to get revised. I think that's what, any of us, is to talk to Flynn's point, any of us who are straight white men, that's what we need to do, is we need to be able to take a look at a system that has put us at the top historically and have the strength to say, well, this system needs to be revised. And that's really hard to do when you're the one with the privilege, right?
Yeah.
So sorry, that was a not necessarily direct answer to your question, but I think it's always important when you see these manifestos and these statements about what business should be about, to look at who's putting them out and to see if any actions are consistent with the words that they're putting out there. And I think that's a key piece too. For me, to talk about, again, what Flynn was saying, a lot of the work I try to get across to people, for everyone listening, most of the people in your organization don't think that they're leaders. I've asked the question, how many of you are comfortable calling yourself a leader, to over 1,000 different audiences, and less than 1% of the time do I get more than half the people in the room willing to raise their hands. People are not comfortable calling themselves leaders. Most of the people who work for you and work with you have a problem with the title, and that is a fundamental problem. And the first thing we have to do is we have to start making people realize that leadership needs to be disconnected from titles and power. It needs to not be evaluated over blocks of time. It needs to be evaluated by whether or not certain behaviors are consistent and non-negotiable every day. And that's where we have to start. I don't want to go on too far, but the first step is making people realize that their leadership should not be evaluated over blocks of time, a semester, a quarter, a year, 5 years. It needs to be evaluated on a day-by-day basis. And because leadership's not in the big things, it's in these consistent things that happen every day. But the thing is, everybody can make those daily commitments, not just the people with the titles.
I think it's kind of a call out to the Davos Manifesto, right? What's the day-to-day things they're doing that demonstrate this new language they're using, right? And Flynn, what do you think on
Yeah,
this?
I think that this idea of action, daily leadership and action is really critical, because kind of going to what we've been discussing, it's one thing, and we're seeing this all the time in frameworks or ethical principles that are being put out, or things going on brochures, because we hear sustainability and ethical leadership is kind of en vogue. But, for example, it's one thing to talk about, more diversity in leadership, but if we're not also creating safe spaces for those people to rise and be in charge and have power, then we're just putting people in situations where they're not going to thrive. So we have to go from diversity to kind of a radical inclusion and representation, and creating those circumstances. And I think the key here that we've been talking about a bit is, what are you willing to give up so that someone else can have a seat at the table? And as human beings, we are very adverse to, if we never had it, it's kind of psychologically okay, we never had it, but giving something up and giving and spending that privilege so we can pull out a chair at the table. And also a seat at the table, not for someone that's like us, but for someone with a different lived experience and point of view, I think is so critical. And that's, as you were just saying, the daily actionable work of really kind of walking the talk, and what are we willing to give up to create a future where we can all thrive.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about if you've never had it, right? We were chatting, before we were recording about, I'm Canadian, and what that means is that I come down here to the States and people ask, hey, how do you pay these huge taxes? And the thing is, I don't know any different. It's all I've ever known. But I can imagine if you're moved from somewhere where it's totally different and you're transplanted, all of a sudden it seems like such an imposition to, be forking over this kind of tax burden. But at the same time, all I've ever known is the benefits we get from it. And so I think that's a really big piece that you just hit on, is just how things aren't wrong. They just feel different. And what was the great quote that I heard someone say, and I wish I could remember, I could attribute it properly, but it was, when you've always had privilege, it's amazing how much equality feels like oppression. And that, I think, is, and I guess I got to ask Flynn too, I get asked a lot during Q&As, about diversity in leadership, particularly gender diversity. And the question always is what role do I, as the historically privileged group, the historically dominant group as a straight white man, what role do we play in trying to make sure that diversity is prioritized, without making it seem as if the person whose job it is to do this, the people whose job it is to do it, are white men? Like, is that not in some way disempowering to the agency of women to say, the only way we balance this out is if, straight white men are willing to do it? I've always struggled with that as I try to answer that question. Do you have any insight on that?
It's very complicated. And these are questions we're asking ourselves. And again, having diverse lived experiences across race and gender and age and ability and socioeconomic status, it's all intersecting, is so important. And I think one visual that really ties it together is this, if anyone's seen the visual about equality versus equity. So equality would be, you're looking out at a baseball game and it's the same, the fence is the same level for everyone. But the problem is if someone is shorter, they can't see over the fence. So equity would be kind of lifting that person up so that we actually get to equality, right? So we actually get to that, full equality. So I think that, it's a great question and it's a challenge. And I think it's also temporal. So there needs to be a space for all of these voices and for all of us to be lifting each other up. But I think one of the key things is to say, okay, whose voice is being marginalized right now? And moving that voice to the center and giving more space to what has traditionally, historically been oppressed or been marginalized. And it starts with passing the mic to those types of people, because eventually we all need to have that equal say. But it starts with bringing people to the center that have traditionally been so disadvantaged for so many intersecting reasons. And that's very complex. But it starts with having those conversations and being willing to move outside from the center so someone else can step in and speak for themselves, as opposed to being spoken for as well.
Yeah, and I think it's what's really interesting is I think about what you were saying there is the idea that over time, everybody getting equal, like an equal chance at the mic might mean that for a little while, people who've had it dominantly need to have less of it. That's the whole equality versus equity concept, right? That a lot of people get mixed up is like, hey, yeah, we got to let other people have the mic, but that also means that some of us have to hold it a little bit less for a while to start to deal with the imbalance, because equal doesn't always mean fair. And one thing I talk to young leaders is that, look, as you go out into the world, don't go out there into the world believing that equal is the same as fair, because if we treat things equally, sometimes it is wildly unfair. And that reality, I see people who are very influential sometimes start to believe that equal is fair.
Yeah.
And usually people believe, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Finish your thought. And then you inspired me about one thing I wanted to mention when you were done.
I completely blew out of my mind because I want to know what you have to say.
So when you were
it was there for just a second. It's all good.
So your beautiful talk on everyday leadership and the lollipop, when you were just talking, it also made me think that how beautiful would it be if passing the mic and making space and stepping aside so someone else could be at the center, if we could also start to consider that its form of leadership. You don't have to be at the center, and you are being a leader by letting someone else step to center stage and share with the world their lived experience. We could broaden the definition, and then, as you said, all of us become leaders in our own way, but being a leader doesn't always mean being at the center.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of the work that I do, especially because the way we've taught leadership and the examples we used early on, as you hit it on the head, the examples we were given of leaders were almost all giants, presidents and scientific groundbreakers, and mostly men and mostly white and mostly supposedly straight. And what happens is when we teach people that this is what leaders look like, the only place we look for leadership are from people who fit that mold. And not only is it the idea of handing over the mic, but realizing that leadership sometimes doesn't even have a stage. Like, it's not front and center. For me, and what you're going to have more success for those listening in terms of spreading leadership throughout your organization is when you start to recognize leadership is in individual interactions rather than over blocks of time. So it might not just be saying, let's pass the mic. And I know that we're using that as sort of as a metaphor, but it might be in that moment where you simply ask someone if they're okay. It's a question of asking someone how they felt about what just happened at a meeting. And that moment, that individual just recognition of another person's humanity and how important what they think is, that is a moment of leadership. And one of the things that I often will say to people is, look, if you really want to start identifying leadership in your organization, or at least opportunities to recognize it, look for the word just. Like, listen when your employees, particularly those in the middle who are older employees who might, what you might think of capped out in where they're going to go in their career in terms of position, listen when they use the word just, when they say, I'm just a receptionist, or I'm just the janitor, or I'm just middle management. Because what they're doing is they're diminishing themselves in front of you. And one thing I try to tell leaders, particularly those in positional leadership roles, do not ever allow someone who you know is a person of worth to diminish themselves in front of you. So be on the lookout for that word just, because we do it all the time in our own language. But when we let other people who work with us and for us use that word to describe who they are and what they do, what we're doing is we're letting them think they're less than they are. And one of the great ways that we can take a moment and let someone know that they are a leader or they do matter is to make sure that every time you hear the word just out. And that, if I could pass one practical tip on to anyone listening, start paying attention to how often you use that word, because you're teaching your kids to use it too. And it's a powerful diminishing word.
One of the things I do, at least when I'm working with executive teams, is I kind of let them know that it's my feeling that the people that got us here, the leaders that got us here today, might not be the one to lead us into the future. And that's kind of maybe difficult for them to swallow or even consider, because they're the ones at the top right now. So what are your thoughts on that? Is it that we have a new style of leadership, or the people that got us here today, they're not going to be able to get us into the future?
Yeah, I would think, I think one of the things that makes me think of is actually stepping away from appearances and things like age, because I've found that, some of the most vibrant, incredible people I know are on the older side. And then, of course, we have these incredible youth movements of people that are so wise. So I think broadening our perspectives beyond that initial first impression, which again has kept us alive in terms of a survival instinct. We are animals after all, but really fighting all of those biases and prejudices, I think, is incredibly important. And I think that the idea, Shakespeare said it, many have said it, that we all have a role to play. And I talk about this a lot in my book and in generally, that you don't have to be exceptional to be special and worthy. And, a lot of times we see the founder isn't the best CEO, or you have brilliance in some area, but we all need help. And everything, that's incredible and beautiful is ultimately built by teams. We're all human, we're flawed, we're magical, we're majestic, we are imperfect. And this idea that we don't have to be exceptional, which of course society is teaching us all the time, is really critical. Because I think and speak and talk a lot about collective intelligence, and we can feel so small individually, but together we can do so much. We have a lot to learn from animals in that respect. So I think that reframing the idea that we all have brilliance to share with the world, and we all have times when it's great to listen and to seek guidance from others as well.
It's interesting too, because in some ways I come from the other angle too, which is that some of the things about the collective wisdom or the collective thinking we do need to get tossed aside so that we can start to realize that on an individual level that we can reframe how we think, and that'll change our behavior, which then in turn will impact positively the way we interact with others. And I think, to go back to your question for a second though, it's interesting when we say the people who lead us now might not be the people who lead us into the future. Yeah, maybe that means totally different individuals. But I also think that a big part of what's happened in my life has made me realize that sometimes the person you are now isn't the person who should lead you into the future. And, I talk about, this is day one and the idea of living values every day. But for me personally, it came from, I'm a recovering alcoholic. And that whole idea of, look, I'm not going to worry about the grander world. I'm not going to worry about 5 years from now. If you don't want to have a drink for the rest of your life, you have to choose not to have a drink today. And then you have to treat every day of the rest of your life as if it's the first day of your recovery. Because on the first day of any commitment, there's an inherent humility, a commitment, and a forgiveness. And so a big part of what I want to get across to people too is that when we evaluate our leadership in our lives by where we are in terms of our career or our finances or our titles, that's what defines us right now. But what it does, it makes us feel as if the lot is already cast, that there's nothing that can change. And if one thing that sort of, being a recovering alcoholic or moving from someone who was bipolar and unmedicated to someone who now takes better care of himself, from someone who used to be 300 pounds to someone who's 100 pounds lighter, for me, to answer your question, yeah, maybe we should take a look at the fact that who we are now might not be able to take us into the future, or our leaders now. But that doesn't mean the leaders have to change. It doesn't mean the people who are leaders have to change from person to person. It just means that who we are capable of changing the way we think, the way that we act, that the way we've done it for 35, 40 years. We can start to shift and change that. And I think that when we tell people that, and we remind them that when they do a good job, that is personal leadership, if we can instill that through our entire organizational culture, we're in a better place. So yeah, maybe we need someone else to lead us into the future, but that someone else could still be you.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. I want to wrap up here because we're moving out of time here, and the final two questions. The first one is just any kind of final thoughts or insights from this dialogue, and I'll start with Flynn.
I think that these are questions and conversations that will forever be imperfect and evolving, but being willing to have them, and particularly with people that might not be like you, I think are really incredibly important for getting a much bigger display of lived experiences in terms of leadership, and thinking about it in a much broader way as we think about the critical issues that we'll be needing to solve. And that there is a lot to be afraid of course, but there's also a lot to be hopeful for. And part of why my book ended up being so radical is it takes this scary topic and people say, oh my gosh, it's optimistic and it's hopeful. And I think we can't afford not to be. And there's so many different ways that we can be leaders, from our families, neighborhoods, communities, and beyond, in ways that we might not have been taught, but that we can certainly start to embody and remind ourselves that we all have the capacity to play our role in a way that makes us a leader in our own lives and in our own communities.
Great. And Drew?
I have to echo it exactly the same. I think that, and that's so nice and original. Here's your final thoughts. I'm just going to say the same thing. But what Flynn said was hope. That word hope, because there's so much that makes us easy to not hope right now. And one thing that someone told me a long time ago, where they're just like, it's all going to be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. Mm. And I've always liked that, but I had someone add to it later that said, that doesn't mean you're supposed to sit around and wait for it to get better. And I think that hope is such a powerful thing. There's so much that we don't know, but there's always been so much that we don't know. And we have found a way to learn more. And that will constantly be an ongoing process. But what I often say to people is that, look, you don't know, and we should have hope, and hope is a powerful force, but we also have to plan. And I think that that's what you see with the work of people like Flynn, is that you're saying, look, we don't know. And look, we can't be perfect, but I've got a plan to keep trying to find out. And that, to me, I think is key. And if I could leave anything with people, I always like to ask one question, is I ask people to honestly ask themselves, why do you matter? Mm. And I think a lot of the problems that we're facing now is that people don't actually have an answer to that question because no one's asked them that before. So if you have kids, make sure that you keep asking them that on a daily basis, because right around the time we send them to school, they stop believing that they matter and they start believing that other people are supposed to determine why they matter. Mm. And a lot of us never unlearn that lesson. And so when we recognize that we matter, we treat other people like they matter, and we act every day in a way that has impact. I think that's so important to generate the hope that Flynn was talking about, because this is a complex world, but your behavior and your focus on it can be simple. And that's what builds up into these incredibly complex things.
That's great. And then final question, what is one word you want to leave for leaders to help them be more intelligent about the future? Flynn?
I think that there's so many, but I think that it would have to be flourishing.
Right. And Drew?
Omphalos, which I was taught means to stare intently at one's navel as an aid to meditation. And one, I just try to find an excuse to use it once a week. But the other one is this. I recently saw a neuroscientist talk about the fact that, you know what? There are parts of our brain so important to creativity that are only activated when we're bored. Mm-hmm. That's it. Like, they just don't work unless we're bored. And we hardly ever allow ourselves to be bored. And so as goofy as the word is, and as funny as what it means is, I try to remember the power of, in all of this complexity, in all of this uncertainty, the power of stopping for a minute, staring at your belly button, and just letting your mind go blank, because it's often in those moments that the coolest stuff actually happens. So in the midst of all of the chaos, trying to figure it all out and serve other people, every now and then, let yourself omphalos. I think that's a word, but I've always loved it. And it sounds fun at parties.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Drew and Flynn, for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, energy, your insights, your wisdom. You're making a great impact in the world, and look forward to seeing your work in the future.
Thank you so much for having us.
Tyler, man, thanks for bringing us together. This has been an absolute blast, and I've never done a podcast like this, and that's really cool.
Thank you for joining us today on the Flowcast. To get a summary of today's dialogue, find out more about today's guests, listen to previous episodes, or discover more about Haku Global's neuroscience-based Futures Intelligent Leadership programs or customized strategic foresight and innovation sprints, visit us at www.haku.global. At Haku Global, we believe it is time for more futures intelligent leadership. The future is something we need to think more intelligently and feel more deeply about, so we can collaborate to discover today's solutions for future problems. If you are in a leadership role and need support or training to scale futures intelligence across your organization, then contact us at Haku Global. This is your host, Tyler Mongan, and until next time, have a preferred and conscious future. Aloha.